I'm Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, and you're watching the Lieutenant Dan podcast. Today, you're going to have the question answered for you. Were our founders atheists or true believers? I mean, after all, they were putting their life on the line for one or the other. Find out what your religious liberty really means to you, where you can pray, when you can pray. Stay with us. America didn't become the freest nation in history by accident. We became the freest because our founding fathers understood a timeless truth. Our rights come from God, not government. And they knew government exists to protect our freedoms, not hand them out. But today, too many Americans have forgotten where those principles came from. For years, the left has worked to erase our history. And when we forget our past, we lose sight of the ideas that made America the greatest nation on earth. We talk about the Constitution. We debate the First Amendment. We argue over religious liberty. But too often we do it without understanding the history behind them. If we want to know where we're headed, it's important to remember where we began. Because history isn't just something we study, it shapes the future of every generation. My guest today has spent decades digging into America's founding and uncovering the truth behind our constitutional system. David Barton is the founder of WallBuilders, an organization dedicated to preserving and teaching the historical, constitutional, and religious foundations of the United States. Today we're talking about the Christian influence on the Founding Fathers, the origins of the Declaration of Independence, the debate over separation of church and state, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, and why all of this still matters today, especially here in Texas. He's brought along some remarkable artifacts from his personal collection, rare pieces that date back to the founding era. You're going to want to see these. Whether you're a student of history, a person of faith, or just someone who wants to better understand where this country came from, I think you'll find this conversation worth your time. I'm glad you're with us. I'm Dan Patrick. You're listening to the Lieutenant Dan podcast. Let's go behind the headlines. I love history. My dad taught me history when I was growing up. We used to go to the battlefields, went everywhere we could go to learn about history. And I admire people who love history. And David Barton with me today is, I would say, David, you're like number one for me of people who love history because you have a collection of particularly our founding fathers and how this nation started. It may be the biggest collection in the world or the biggest collection in America.
It's considered to be the largest private collection. We don't
private.
rival the 20 million items of Smithsonian National Archives,
yes.
But as far as the private collection it is, and actually in the 250th where we are now, we're the only museum in the United States on record that is known now that has something displayed from all 56 signers of the Declaration. So archives, Smithsonian has that. They just don't like the founders, so we do.
So your museum is in?
We have one in Las Colinas, North Dallas, one over in Aledo, West Fort Worth. So the one in Las Colinas, I run the nonprofits for Glenn Beck, and so we have a big museum over there, everything from space capsules to wagons and cars and cannons. And then the one in Aledo is more of the documents and books and the smaller kind of items.
So when did you start your collection?
Started it, for me, it'd probably be about 1989. I was a math and science guy. I went to college, math and science scholarship, hated history completely. And a lot of that was unfortunately what I was taught here in Texas in my public schools in sixth grade. I had a sixth grade history teacher told me George Washington had 26 illegitimate children, giving new meaning to the phrase Washington slept here.
Right.
I thought, I think I can do without those guys.
Yes.
And then I find out that was nowhere close to the truth. So I love history now, but I hated it for a long time.
Yeah, I had a great history teacher, and our teachers make a difference on you.
They do.
Point you in different directions. I should have majored in history in college instead of English because I would have gotten an A. I did not have an A final grade in English when I graduated Maryland. So what do you have here for us? I want to talk about today, and you testified for us on religious liberty. I'm chair of the Religious Liberty Commission for the President, and in fact, he has his report on our 7 hearings of work. You came to our hearing in Dallas. So tell me about our founders and what they truly believed, particularly in religious liberty, the first of the Bill of Rights, compared to what people say they
Yeah.
believed. Because there's a big, it's like you finding out about George Washington. So let's talk about what the founders really believed about religious liberty.
They gave us something I think we underappreciate because we take it for granted. So just going back, there was a study done by University of Illinois and University of Chicago Law School, 5,800 years of recorded human history, thousands of nations. The average length of a governing document in the history of the world is 17 to 19 years. So we're sitting here at 250, and we just think it's another year. This year's
Right.
going to be gone. We'll be 250. We don't understand. France had a revolution 20 years after we did. They were our ally. We probably couldn't have won the American Revolution without. 20 years later, they had a revolution. They're now in their 15th constitution in that same period of time. So the first thing is we need to appreciate America. We don't understand the blessings we have. Second thing is the 56 guys who gave us that document. Remarkable people. They were average. You can't really make them a group of founders because a lot of them didn't even like each other. Two of the guys from Maryland kept passing bills against each other. You'd love this in the Senate. One would introduce a bill to cancel the other, and he'd introduce a bill, and they were going back. But they had common values and common principles. So the personalities are really different of those guys, which makes them very unique. And we really don't know them today. I speak at a lot of universities and law schools, and my son Tim does as well. And he carries a gift card with him, and he holds it up and says, any of you that can name 5 signers of the Declaration, I'll give you this gift card. He's had that gift card 9 years. we don't know who the founders are.
Everybody's thinking right now watching the podcast, can I name 5
Yeah, can you
signers?
name 5? Exactly.
Yeah.
And so that's what some of this is. Now, their faith is super strong. This is actually George Washington's first military order. And this is Abraham Lincoln. This is from Abraham Lincoln, who's repeating George Washington's order. Abraham Lincoln's doing it in the Civil War. But George Washington says, I hope and trust that every officer and man will endeavor to live and act as becomes a Christian soldier, defending the dearest rights and liberties of his country. Now, if you had President Trump today say, I hope every soldier acts as a Christian, people go through the roof. That's Washington's first military order. That's what Lincoln covered. So you go back. Generally, collectively, I think of the 56, all but one had open professions of Christianity. These are some of the works they did, signed with the Declaration.
What's the big book?
This is a Bible from 1791, signed with the Declaration, John Witherspoon, who's the president of Princeton. By the way, John Witherspoon is the man most responsible for the economic clauses in the Constitution, but he's a preacher and the president of Princeton. And he did this Bible in 1791 so that families could have a Bible that they could study together. We were not allowed to print Bibles in English in America until 1781.
Right.
So this is 10 years later. Now, this is a book of his sermons. He has volumes of sermons, hundreds of sermons. So he is a typical evangelical minister. This came from Charles Thompson. This book right there, on the 4th of July, actually, only 2 guys have their name on the Declaration 4th of July. The rest of them sign it August the 2nd. 4th of July, it's just John Hancock and Charles Thompson. That is called the Thompson Bible. He translated the Greek Septuagint into English. It took 19 years, but that's considered the most scholarly American translation of the Bible. You have individuals like Francis Hopkinson. Francis Hopkinson, he designed the American flag, 1777. He came up with the Great Seal of the United States. George Washington appointed him as one of our original federal judges. But he's a church music director, a choir leader, and he's an organist. And so he created this book, and what you see here is this is the first book with musical notation in America. He took the 150 Psalms and set them all to music. So this is a hymn book. It's what he used at church where he was organist. And it's amazing to think of singing the Psalms. And for people who know much about the book of Psalms, you know that Psalms 119 is a really long song in the Bible. It's 38 pages long in that hymn book, if you can imagine going to church and singing that.
And this one, the print is so small. Show that to the camera.
This is a tiny print. And imagine typesetting this with tweezers. And
I can't even imagine.
It's just, I mean, all this is hand done, obviously.
And who's?
This is from signer of the Declaration, Benjamin Rush.
Oh, Benjamin Rush.
John Adams said he's one of the 3 most notable, but Benjamin Rush started the first Bible Society in America. He started the Sunday School movement in America.
Right.
This is a piece he did in 1791 that gave a dozen reasons we would never take the Bible out of public schools. So we're told that they didn't want religion in public? No, no. And so that's what this stuff is. This is a letter from the last surviving signer of the Declaration, Charles Carroll. He died at the age of 95, 96. But this is a letter, 81 years old, professing his Christian beliefs and faith, because his family said, man, you're getting old, 81. By the way, the average lifespan in America back then was 33 years old. So he's sitting here at 81, and it's like, you're going to die someday, you're ready to meet God. And so he gives a long profession of faith.
So David, why is it, and when did it happen, that America started turning their back on having God in everyday life, in our schools, in our public square? I know that it began with Madalyn Murray O'Hara in large part back in the 60s from Baltimore, as I believe, who wanted to kick God and prayer out of public schools. So where was this turn? Because our nation is founded upon this, but people today mistakenly believe that separation of church and state is in the Constitution, which it's not. But the left has used this, I call it the anti-God movement, has used this to kick God out of our society and to erase this history, because they're really wanting to erase this as if these people didn't believe this, if it didn't happen.
Yeah.
So when was the turn?
The turn happened in 1890. But you have to understand it goes through several generations. So in 1890, we take Darwin's thesis of social evolution and say because man's always evolving and it's secular creation, it's not theistic evolution, it's secular evolution without God. We start believing that in the 1890s, and so we start teaching that to students. Those students become professors in the 1920s. Those professors in the 1920s teach their students who start writing the textbooks in the 1940s. Post-World War II is where you'll see dramatic shift and change. And while that's where it shows up, it started back in the 1890s. And so you can transfer it, you can track it over generations. And so, and as you mentioned, Madalyn Murray O'Hara, in 1947 is the first time ever the Supreme Court used the phrase separation church and state without quoting Jefferson's letter.
Was that Black, Justice Black? Or?
That was part of that decision, that
Yes.
that Everson versus Board of Education.
Yes, sir.
And so Jefferson has about 32,000 letters that he wrote. One of them is to the Danbury Baptist,
Right.
and that's that separation letter. It's only 233 words long. That's 3 paragraphs.
Right.
They only quoted 8 words out of that letter. Now, previously, when they quoted Jefferson's letter, they quoted the full letter. And if you go back to 1878, they quoted separation church and state to keep religion in public, because Jefferson said separation church and state keeps the government from stopping religious activities. So then, in 1947, they only quote the 8 words and said, oh, we got to stop religious activity. Opposite.
It's the biggest lie
It's the biggest lie.
told in America. And as chair of the Religious Liberty Commission, I mentioned we had 7 hearings, and we had them on education, higher education, health care, the military, which you were a part of. And we're going to have a second podcast with you just on the military, what's happened to God in the military under Obama and Biden. But we came to the conclusion, David, in the recommendations to the president, because we were a commission appointed by the president. Incredible committee members I had, Kelly Shackelford, who's argued so many cases before the Supreme Court, Franklin Graham, Reverend Graham, Bishop Cardinal Dolan,
Awesome people.
Bishop Robert Barron, Ben Carson, Dr. Phil, who's a person who has a great faith. And what came back to us time and time again was when someone decided to come after someone, they always said it's separation of church and state. And either those people don't know what's in the Constitution, or they do know, and they're using it thinking the public and the media will be ignorant of that, and they get away with not just punishing people. I mean, in some cases, wanting to send them to jail for their beliefs. So how did it get so out of hand in the last 20 to 30 years? And I love that generational thing. You know, Darwin, who he taught, became professors, and they taught and wrote the textbooks. So how have we gotten to this extreme? And do you see it coming back? Do you see it coming back with a new, younger generation?
Yeah, what's interesting is it takes 3 generations to make a change. The first generation can teach something, and the second generation goes silent on it, and the third generation can introduce something exactly opposite because that generation hadn't heard anything. And so if you say, hey, the Founding Fathers, that they're strong believers in God, most of them Christians, and then if you just stop teaching the Founding Fathers totally for 20 to 30 years, now you can get professors to come back and say, oh, they were all atheists, agnostics, deists. And that's what happened with separation of church and state. So from the time that the court said, hey, the separation thing, 1947, it was another 20 years before they started making decisions using that phrase. So you got to get everybody used to having that phrase. And so it's really a slower process than most people think. And when you see something appear, go back to 20 and 30 years and say, all right, where was the root?
So who was behind that movement?
There were several behind it. It's what we now call secular progressives. And the problem with the progressive is their belief is that everything, because of Darwinian evolution, everything is always moving forward. So you can't look back and say this is what works because we've evolved since then, which means the number one course that is useless is history because it's always looking back. It's interesting that in the 50 states today, history is the only course in school that does not have an end-of-course test. So that's the only. Now, what does that mean? Teachers teach the test because that's where merit pay comes from other things. If you're not going to test on it, you're not going to teach it. So it's interesting that is the one course that we test on the STEM, science and engineering and math. We don't test on history. And that's what evolutionists use is, oh, you don't care about that. Oh, but they were all atheists, agnostics, deists. Oh, we've always had slavery. All that stuff.
So are these people today who continue to push this false narrative of separation of church and state and that our founders were atheists, which obviously your books and many books that you have and our history and the documents underscore that that's a lie, that they were atheists. They may have been at certain degrees of their belief, but they surely weren't atheists. And so many quotes that you could do quotes for an hour of what they said about God and the belief in this country. But is it an atheist movement?
No, it's a lot of ignorant people who have. There's a great Bible verse, Luke 6:40. Jesus says, "Every student, when he's fully trained, will be like his teacher." And so what happens is when teachers have the ability to test, and they've taught you certain things, and they test on that, that's what you believe. And it never crosses your mind that, I wonder if my teacher's telling me the truth. I wonder if they know what the truth is. No student asks that. And so we are in a place of ignorance now, literally. And so what we're finding is, particularly with Gen Z, not the boomers or the X or the Y, but the Gen Z, they're getting back into original history and demanding to see the documents. Yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah, there's been this surge, and of course all over particularly in Europe, the church is dying. In America, we've seen attendance go down. We've seen the polling where in the last 10 to 20 years, people are stepping away from church or stepping away from believing that religion or faith is important to them. Of course, I always focus back whenever there's a tragedy for all the people that say they don't believe, whether it's 9/11 to the country, whether it's a school shooting, or whether someone just had a divorce or lost their job, people suddenly get to their knees pretty quick. Even though they say they don't believe that God doesn't play a part in their life. But the polls would show we're backing up. But at the same time, we're seeing an uptick in younger people being involved in the history of all these founders and what our country is based upon, and an uptick of going back to church for younger people. So there's a difference between, I know you've talked about an awakening and a revival. So
in America's history, there's been 8 religious revivals we point to. There was the Jesus movement in the 70s. Prior to that, you had the Billy Sunday movement in the 1920s, all the major cities. You had the Dwight L. Moody stuff. You go back to Finney and the Third Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening in Asbury. So you have 8 revivals, but 5 of them did not change the culture. 3 of them did. And those were called Great Awakenings, the First, Second, Third Great Awakening, where that people, when they had a profession of faith, they also got into things like the Scriptures and said, oh, I didn't know that's what Scripture said. And so we've gone through the thing, and I have to be careful here, but I'm a conservative. I am a traditional Bible-believing Christian, and I know that people like Pelosi and Biden profess Christianity. It has nothing to do with the biblical Christianity that has been traditional for 2,000 years. But I can't say that they can't profess Christianity. They can. But what happens is there's a return back to the book, back to the Bible. And when you return to the Bible, then behavior starts changing. Now you start seeing, hey, marriage is important, and raising children is important, and having children with a moral foundation on them, that's important. And that's what we're seeing with the Gen Z, is that return. And actually, we've seen in the last 2 weeks, the stats are up, and they're more pro-life than they've ever been. The same on, they're actually coming back to traditional marriage.
Right.
They're rejecting that non-traditional marriage. So we're seeing, and that's what an awakening looks like. It starts affecting the cultural beliefs. And if those kids continue with those beliefs, they're going to be our leaders in 20
They'll
years.
be our leaders.
And what kind of laws will they pass based on what they believe?
You know, we could talk for hours about this. I find it so fascinating. And, you know, I've written a book on the Bible many years ago, about 20 years. And, you know, I've not been to seminary, but one day I woke up.
And that may be a really good thing.
That might be a good thing. I just thought I need a Bible for dummies, like I was. And, you know, one of the first things I say, and I can't remember everything I wrote now. It's been literally 2002 that I wrote that book. But the second most important book you'll ever read to read the most important book, the Bible. But, you know, one of my tips is, if you're opening the Bible, don't start at Leviticus.
That's right.
You know, I mean, it's simple things. You know, it's a project. But and we did a Christian movie that has led to our first seminary, the biggest seminary in the world for people in prison. We've graduated now over 300 pastors in Texas in prison who are serving 20 years to life.
Yeah.
And now we have a seminary for women. It's Be an Angel, not Be an Angel. It's Heart of Texas, excuse me. Be an Angel is the board I serve on for children with disabilities, but Heart of Texas. And by the way, folks, you can, if you go to YouTube, you can watch the movie we did, the documentary, Heart of Texas. Be sure you get the right one, Heart of Texas. But the Lord has touched me so many times in my life, and every day I learn something more, and then I meet people like you, and then, on this religious liberty committee of the 12 committee members, including myself, you know, I said in the Rose Garden when the president gave an executive order on it, it was an idea that I gave him, and he liked it because, you know, look, he said, President Trump has said Jesus more than any other president in my lifetime. And he's a believer of religious liberty for all faiths, including if people don't want to believe, you have that right in America too. But I felt like a pair of brown shoes in a room full of tuxedos because I was the least qualified to lead the committee. I feel like I'm a pair of brown shoes with you because you know this.
May I throw in one little historical tidbit?
Bring it out.
You said don't start with Leviticus.
Yes.
That takes me back to Thomas Jefferson, because you just voiced Thomas Jefferson.
Is that what he said?
What's interesting, people may know, I know nearly every university, every secular university will teach the Jefferson Bible.
Yes.
Thomas Jefferson went through and cut out all the stuff he
have a
disagreed
copy. I
with,
have one of those
that
copies.
Jefferson Bible. If you read Jefferson's own writings about that, what happened was he was very active in evangelizing the gospel to native tribes in Virginia. We actually have documents from him as president where he signed giving federal funds to send missionaries to preach the gospel to Indians, federal funds. So Jefferson got a sermon given to him by a Scotch minister who was preaching in England and said, if you want to help evangelize Indians, don't give them the full Bible because they might open to Leviticus.
Right.
And he said, give them the teachings of Jesus. Jefferson read that sermon. He had 2 Bibles in the White House. He cut out what we call the red letters of Jesus.
Right.
What he cut out was the teachings of Jesus. And so he pasted them end to end, and he gave that back to the guy and said, take this, print this, it's cheaper than a Bible, and it's all the teachings of Jesus. So it's not cutting out stuff he disagreed with. He literally went through the red letters. They didn't have red letter Bibles back then, but he went through. And so that is another historical misportrayal. Jefferson was very active in helping get the teachings of Jesus out, and if you read those teachings, the critics say, oh, he left out all the supernatural. No, there's lots of miracles in there that Jesus did.
Real quick, I remember you saying this in the committee hearing that we had at the Religious Liberty Commission when you testified. That we're talking about Jews in America, and you know we talk about the Judeo-Christian ethic, the Old and the New Testament. That Washington, and I think if my memory serves me, you said there were only 2,500 Jews maybe in America.
Yeah, that's right.
At the time Washington was president, but he went to them.
He did.
He went to them.
And they were active, and they were part of the military. He was aggressively active with the Jewish people. And it's interesting, we had Jews elected in America back in the early 1700s. And so the two people that financed Washington kept him in the field. One was a Jew, one was a Christian. And one of the great statues you'll see is in Chicago Business District, George Washington holding the hands of Haim Solomon, a Jew, and Robert Morris, a Christian, Jewish Christian, and that was what upheld Washington. So he did a great letter to the Hebrew Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island, 1890 or 1790. It's a wonderful letter, but he visited with those people, and he was really strong religious liberty guy, Judeo-Christian true.
So we're going to do a second episode with David on God in the military. You'll find fascinating. I think I know a little bit about history until I sit down with you. You know a chapter and verse. You have a story for every anecdote I could bring up. And thank you for being with us on this podcast. And everyone, look forward to the next podcast with David Barton. I'm telling you, this guy knows more about history than anyone I've ever talked to. If you like this, you're going to like the next episode here on the podcast when he talks about how Biden and Obama kicked God out of our military.